Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Cohen, the author of An Introduction to the Art and Science of Chinese Tea Ceremony. Today, we're discussing Book 2, Chapter 4, Sections 1 through 5, An Introduction to the Production of Clay Ceramics. Here to talk about this chapter is our editorial team, Patrick Penny.
Hey, hey.
And Zongzun Li.
Hello.
Hello, Pat. Hello, Zongjun. This chapter is purely factual, a foundational chapter for the following sections and the rest of the book. And thus, it doesn't really lend itself to our standard format. So we'll try to keep this a touch conversational. And instead of doing a rapid fire quiz, we can talk about some of the broader umbrella topics that are going to come up in the rest of the book and start to at least postulate a little bit on where we think certain theories are going to shake out. So it turns out that the material science of ceramics is quite complicated. Paraphrasing from this chapter's introduction, while chemistry is predictive of the qualities of glaze, it is the physical structure of the clay that determines its attributes. The transformation of ore into clay is best modeled as a transformation of a metamaterial, or a material of materials, a complex outcome of chemistry, mineralogy, and processing. Any ore in clay can be analyzed at the level of its processing steps, the separate mineral component, and the compounds that make up each component. With that, where did you find the most complexity in this chapter? Or where did you find that this chapter resolved complexity for you? Pat, let's start with you.
I think, as you were just alluding to, the different compounds, right, metals and materials within each different type of clay and how they interact to form, the various different types of clay that we're all very familiar with. Things like, a hongni, a zini. I think what was clarifying for me was the part where you do, go on to say that physical structure, right, is much more important than any breakdown of aluminum, iron, or silicates, because that is, I think, an area where not only myself, but many people get caught up thinking about how different ratios of, ores or impurities, right, will affect the outcome of brewing a tea in any given teapot or clay. So I think that certainly resolves some complexity for me. I think an area where this discussion opened up more complexity and made me think about clay a little bit differently was I was very familiar with what vitrification was as it applies to porcelain. But I don't think I ever thought of Yixing having any degree of vitrification. And so the way you break it out in the chapter, it's pretty clear that right there, depending on how it's fired, to what degree, there can be, right, some degree of vitrification. That changed how I think about the interaction at a surface level with the material, because obviously where there is vitrification, there will be very little to no interaction between the tea solution and the material surface within the Yixing. That was just an interesting thing that opened up the way I look at firing and Yixing.
Doing our research in all the clays and the kinds of the clays scattered around different areas, one of the complexity that we frequently encounter is the mixed use of different terminologies, right? Like we translate into English as ores or as clay or as, various different terms. But in the original text, a lot of different terms were used interchangeably. So I think one of the key components that this chapter resolved is we're trying to, clean up the usage of terminology so that we know exactly what we are referring to in the later chapter.
Undergoing much of that research, I would say that it is maddening reading through something where they interchangeably use ore and then clay. And then even when you turn to the scientific literature, that continues. Geologists refer to the raw material as clay, where the ceramic artists would never consider that to be clay. It couldn't be used in order to build a ware. And so I share much of the same struggles, Zongjun.
And also other terms like maturation or ripening, when they were used in different contexts, it's all shou or shoucheng in Chinese, but they have different implication or definition when it's used in a different procedure when making wares or processing clays.
Zongjun, how much of this understanding or misunderstanding is limited to the English-speaking tea world? Do the same forms of misunderstanding exist in the Chinese tea world?
I think it definitely does. There are two components of disinformation and misinformation. So when a certain text is translated from a misused original text, the information is wrong to begin with. But you frequently also encountered, a misunderstanding of the original text, which result into a wrong translation. One of the difficulties that why each of these chapters take longer time than usual to be written and published is that there are a lot of back and forth checking of context and definition when we, walk into a certain usage of words.
During your fact-checking process, did you have any difficulty in finding or verifying this type of information, or did you find it once it had been laid out to be readily available or apparent?
Upon receiving this chapter from you, Jason, there were many things I highlighted. Is this fact, or are you, where are you citing this from? Where is this a reference from? I must have had, it wasn't a crazy amount, but there must have been 6 or 7 lines where I just asked you, can you prove this? Where is a reference? I need a citation. Not because I didn't believe it to be true, but just because while many of the claims made sense to me logically, of course, part of the process of writing a book and editing, right, is ensuring that what we set out to write is as factual as possible. And so, you did have a lot of references you were pulling from. You shared those with me. I was able to cross-check it and then look to some scientific journals, right, to also see it in use in some of the field literature. Tried to pull from more than just what you shared as your references to ensure that how you synthesized the material made sense and was accurate. But yeah, a lot of this I did not know, which was great, right? It's one of the fun parts about going along on this process with you is a lot of these things I assumed to be true. As I said, logically they made sense, but I did not know or had no reference to where they were factually true. So it was a great process, I think, for me as well to go through this.
Yeah, there was quite a bit here that I did not know. I'm used to thinking about Yixings from a brewing perspective. I'm used to thinking about them from a pairing perspective or an effect, right? But usually at this point, you're thinking of them as finished material. I mean, you and I had gone to Korea and had thrown and fired some ceramic wares, and we have a little bit of hands-on experience with the formation and the construction of ceramics. But it's not as if we've ever been down in the clay or ore mines. It's not as if we've ever had to take whole pieces of ore and break them down and wait 3 years, right, in order to use clay. We showed up with an ongi clay master who had master level handcrafted clay aging in jars. He said, "Here's a little bit of clay.
Have fun.
Yeah,
Good luck.
Try to make something that doesn't melt in the kiln or explode."
Yeah, and as I was going through this chapter, the elasticity and plasticity piece really brought me back to that because my God, ongi was difficult clay to work with. And so just as I was reading through both the plasticity and the particle shape and particle size distribution piece, it really got me thinking about, what the makeup of that ongi clay must have really looked like. Because as you stated, we've actually had a lot of opportunities to work on the kind of construction and finishing side of ceramics. You and I, beyond ongi, have got to hand build our own raku tea bowls. We got to work with Willie Singleton, who's a potter based out of Pennsylvania, who studied with some famous Japanese tea ceramics masters before as well. We've done a lot of construction, a good bit of firing, but yeah, never been down in the pits. And so I think that's an opportunity for us in the future to learn some more. But just from a theoretical perspective, this really helped to fill in a lot of the holes that I think I had in my knowledge framework.
Similarly, what are some of the myths of Yixing that this chapter addresses?
One is partially what we opened up with, which is the comparison of thinking about the interaction of the tea solution and the Yixing material as being based on the chemical compounds within the ore as it's fired and processed clay, right, as it's fired, versus it being an interaction on with the surface topology, right, and the various different crystalline structures or, the metamaterials making up a material being the larger effect. So we addressed that, I think, pretty well in the beginning of the discussion. And that's certainly one of the, I think, prevalent myths in the tea world, that the compounds within a material are by large in part what makes a specific type of Yixing have the effects that it does have.
Also partially cleans up the myth that the chemical composition being such an important component of the performance of a clay, which is partially incorrect because, processing, maturation, firing technique, all of those will have major effects on the final performance of the ware.
There's one myth that's, of course, near and dear to my heart. That is the open and closed pore structures and whether or not a Yixing will slack and degrade in water, including seawater. There are no issues with shipwreck teaware.
There isn't any witchery in Yixing teapots. It won't melt in water.
I don't think that's a myth I was aware of. Where have you guys been seeing a lot of that propagated?
Not so much about it melting and slacking, but that the Yixing will absorb seawater and become salty and become unusable. But if it can absorb any water, it's because there's an open pore structure, and if the pore structure is open, then additional water will move the salt out. Right, salt migration is going to be governed by the same laws of diffusion that you'd expect. So if you have a salty teapot and soak it in fresh water, then the salt will dissipate until it hits equilibrium.
It's an easy thing to test beyond the theoretical framework. We just need to buy more shipwreck Yixings, right? And do some sensory analysis. Okay.
Well, all my shipwreck teapots taste great. I don't know what anyone's talking about. Maybe they just got dirty.
The first couple uses, you do give them a rinse, right? Do you notice anything weird about the taste after the first few rinses?
Oh, well, it's not a totally fair question. I mean, there's pretty few shipwreck teawares that I purchase and jump straight into brewing with. Most of the time there's a cold soak and then an inspection, then you're rinsing it, and then you might look at whether you take one of those little magic sponges and just check whether anything's going to rub off anywhere on it, so you know how fragile it is and make sure that it's not suddenly going to start shedding glaze or something when it hits hot water. So they've been pretty thoroughly cleaned by the time they're being used. So I'm definitely not tasting the first rinse water, the first cold soak.
For science, you got to do it next time.
I'll let you know if it's salty.
Maybe lead testing first, but yeah.
Yeah, if it tastes like poisonous cobalt.
Yum.
One other one, it's pretty minor in this chapter. It'll come up again in the next chapter. What do you make about a lot of the focus on iron, or on the focus of iron and shrinkage? People talk about, the shrinkage rate is so important. The shrinkage rate is what makes Juni different from Hongni, Zini. Does this chapter do a good job of addressing that? Do you think that there needs to be a lot more information?
I think you provide the framework regarding shrinkage on a whole level. I don't know if my brain makes the immediate jump from how the drying shrinkage and firing shrinkage as a phenomenon applies directly to any specific clay. So maybe in the future, going forward in the book, you're going to address that, and that's something that would be, I think, useful for the audience. But here, I don't think I'm able to get exactly how the shrinkage plays out differently across clays, or due to different compounds, how that may differ. My mind goes to the hydration of the clay, but it could be very wrong there.
Yeah, well, in the later chapter, you will probably see a number of shrinkage rate linked to every clay type that we have researched. But I don't see a direct relationship or impact of shrinkage rate to the final performance of the teaware. It's mainly a difficulty that ceramists needs to face or needs to solve during their processing of the clay or firing of the clay, because high shrinkage rate will oftentimes result in high crackage rate. I wouldn't necessarily see that there's a direct correlation of shrinkage rate with the final performance of the teaware.
That is an open area for investigation. My final question, looking forward from this chapter, what are some of the theories that we must address in the interaction between Yixing and tea?
Well, I think we need to certainly address the impact of clay type on tea. So things like, how does Juni affect tea versus Zuni versus Hongni or anything else? I think degree of firing is something that would be interesting, and it's something I know we're actually currently investigating. So a clay that is very heavily fired versus obviously still both properly fired to maturity, but one that is fired less or properly versus one that is overfired. Something that we could expect to maybe have more vitrification. That would be interesting to investigate. I think from there, it's kind of hard to investigate, particularly into particle shape and particle size distribution, just because that's something that I don't know that we'd be able to get the knowledge on. Something that the ceramist might know, right? But surface topology is something we certainly could do research on and how that affects tea. And I'd love to dig deeper into that. Zongjun, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, also certain firing techniques might have very interesting impact on the tea flavors as well. For example, like wu hui, a reduction firing, which naturally causes the teapot to turn black. In the past, people widely viewed it as a aesthetic. It's something that scholars were pursued, but we have been trying to investigate its impact on the tea flavor when it's used to brew tea. Similar type of clay, but firing in different techniques might have a divergence in the impact on tea as well.
And I know the tea world was caught a little bit by storm, at least on Instagram, the effects of magnetic teawares versus non-magnetic Yixing. And I think you are going to address things like black coring and things like that in future chapters. But I think it would be interesting to look at if we could attain a magnetic versus a non-magnetic teapot made by the same maker of the same clay, obviously probably different firing. Would we see if there's a difference or not? That would be interesting.
Those are great research topics to look into, and certainly things that we will attempt to address throughout the remainder of the book. But what are the primary theories on interaction? In my mind, there are three. There's firing temperature and porosity, or extent of firing and teapot porosity. There's the Yixing's ability to retain heat, its heat loss curves, and then there's surface texture, surface roughness. Those are what I think are the three predominant theories right now that are being debated for does a Yixing have an effect, right? People might say, okay, Zinni and Juni, they're different, they have a different effect, but it has nothing to do with the material. It just has to do with one keeping heat longer than the other. And some people would say, okay, no, that can't be right. It's that one's more porous than the other. One's higher fired, one's lower fired. You get variations in porosity. And someone else might say, right, actually, it's because the ore itself has different fired in a contemporary kiln, has a different surface texture, which leads to different rates of extraction. Do any one of those theories do you agree with them? Do you believe that one of them is problematic? Do you believe that it's a combination of them? What is your current stated belief that we can return to in subsequent chapters?
Yeah, I don't believe that there's any one specific theory that is going to hold true or that will be easy to test in isolation. I think that there is always going to be some meld in between, and obviously we'll do our best, I think, to obtain the right research materials to isolate these theories while we're doing our testing. While I personally believe that the physical structure, right, and the interaction at the surface level between the tea liquid and the different types of Yixing clay is where the biggest effects on tea is coming from, I do think that things like temperature will also play a role.
Also, maybe certain chemical composition that have a significant higher concentration in certain clay might have certain impact on the tea flavor as well. But that's also open to debate.
Well, everyone, that's all the time that we have today. Thank you for joining us in this edition of Tea Technique Editorial Conversations. Please join us again for our next conversation, Yixing Zisha Or.